Albert Wesker. If you know anything about the Resident Evil series, that name alone probably conjures an image. The dark sunglasses, the slicked back hair, that voice dripping with cold, calculated superiority. The man who casually dodges bullets while monologuing about human evolution and his rightful place as a god among insects. He's become iconic in gaming, a villain so over the top that he verges on camp, yet so genuinely threatening that you can't dismiss him. And tonight, we're going to dissect what makes him tick. What psychological frameworks can help us understand a man who looked at the entire human race and decided it needed to be culled, reshaped, and ruled over by someone of superior genetics, someone like himself, naturally. This is going to be thorough. We're examining Wesker through multiple psychological lenses, dissecting his childhood conditioning, his superiority complex that metastasized into full-blown megalomania, his relationships built entirely on utility rather than connection, and the philosophical underpinnings of his eugenics-obsessed worldview. I'll be using severity ratings like we did with Ethan Winters, scaling from 1 to 5, where 1 is barely noticeable and 5 completely defines the character's existence. But unlike Ethan, whose psychology was shaped by trauma and survival, Wesker's psychology was engineered, deliberately crafted from childhood to produce exactly what it did: a brilliant, ruthless, inhuman architect of apocalypse who saw his own monstrosity as evolution's inevitable next step. So settle in, get comfortable, maybe turn down the lights. We're about to spend a long time inside the mind of a man who spent decades convinced he was destined to become a god, and who came disturbingly close to proving it. The Wesker Children Project and Manufactured Identity. Let's start at the beginning, because understanding Wesker requires understanding that he never had a normal childhood. He never had the chance to develop a natural sense of self, to form organic relationships, to discover his own values through experience. From the moment he was selected as a child, Albert Wesker was a product, a manufactured candidate in Oswell Spencer's grand experiment to create the perfect vessel for viral enhancement, and ultimately to birth a race of superhuman beings, worthy of inheriting Spencer's vision of the future. The Wesker Children Project was eugenics dressed up as science. Spencer identified children with specific genetic markers, indicators of high intelligence, physical capability, and psychological resilience. These weren't orphans plucked from poverty. These were children carefully selected because their genetic profile suggested they could survive what was coming. They were given the Wesker surname, enrolled in umbrella facilities, and raised in an environment that was simultaneously privileged and profoundly dehumanizing. They received the best education, training in multiple disciplines, access to resources most people could only dream of. But all of it was conditional. All of it was in service of a purpose they didn't fully understand until much later. This is what psychologists call identity foreclosure, but taken to an extreme that normal developmental theory barely covers. Identity foreclosure typically describes adolescents who commit to an identity without adequately exploring alternatives, often because authority figures like parents or religious leaders have prescribed who they should become. It's the kid who becomes a doctor because their parents are doctors, who never questions whether that's what they actually want. For most people, even those experiencing identity foreclosure, there's still some degree of agency, some room for eventual rebellion or realization. Wesker didn't get that. His identity wasn't suggested or prescribed. It was engineered. From early childhood, he was conditioned to see himself as exceptional, as fundamentally different from and superior to ordinary humans. This wasn't empty praise or delusional thinking. He was exceptional. His intelligence was measurable, his capabilities demonstrable. The conditioning worked because it was anchored in reality. He could look around at his peers, even the other Wesker children, and recognize that he was often the best performer. He could see the resources being poured into his development and understand, even as a child, that he was valuable in ways others weren't. But here's where the psychology gets dark. When your entire sense of self is built around being a superior specimen selected for a higher purpose, you don't develop the aspects of identity that make someone psychologically human. Empathy becomes vestigial because other people aren't fully real to you. They're variables in equations, tools to be used, obstacles to be removed, or inferiors to be ruled. You don't form genuine attachments because attachment implies equality, and you've been conditioned from childhood to understand that you are fundamentally unequal. You're better. And being better means being alone at the top of a hierarchy that you didn't create but have fully internalized. This manufactured identity, severity level 5, it's absolute, pervasive, foundational to everything Wesker becomes. Unlike someone like Ethan, whose fractured identity is a response to trauma, Wesker's identity was deliberately constructed to be exactly what it is. There's no baseline normal self buried underneath waiting to emerge. The conditioning is the self. The superiority isn't a defense mechanism, it's the architecture. And because it was installed so early and reinforced so consistently, Wesker never develops the psychological tools to question it. Why would he? Every piece of evidence he encounters supports the core belief. He is smarter than almost everyone he meets. He is more capable. He does rise through hierarchies with relative ease. The world keeps proving his superiority complex correct, which means it stops being a complex and becomes what he experiences as simple, observable fact. The other Wesker children provide a grim control group. Most of them died when they were eventually administered the prototype virus that was meant to unlock their full potential. Their genetic profiles were close but not perfect. They were exceptional but not exceptional enough. Albert survived, actually thrived, gained superhuman abilities that put him so far beyond normal human capability that the gap between him and baseline humanity became a chasm. From his perspective, this wasn't luck. This was confirmation. Spencer chose correctly. The virus worked. He was always meant to be what he became. This is the foundational trauma of Wesker's psychology. Except trauma isn't quite the right word because trauma implies damage to a pre-existing healthy structure. Wesker never had that structure. He was built from childhood to be exactly the kind of person who could inject themselves with an experimental virus, fake their own death, betray everyone they'd ever worked with, and sleep soundly because none of it contradicted their core sense of self. If anything, it fulfilled it. Superiority complex and the path to megalomania. Now that we understand the foundation manufactured superiority installed in childhood, we need to trace how that evolved into the full-blown megalomania we see by the time of Resident Evil 5, where Wesker is literally planning to become a god, ruling over a cold and reshaped humanity. This isn't a sudden break with reality. It's the logical endpoint of a belief system that was never challenged, only confirmed, over and over, for decades. Let's talk about what superiority complex actually means psychologically. In Adlerian psychology, superiority complex is understood as a defense mechanism where someone compensates for deep feelings of inferiority by adopting an inflated sense of self-importance. The classic example is the insecure person who constantly brags about their accomplishments, who needs to dominate conversations, who can't tolerate criticism because it threatens the defensive structure they've built. Underneath the superiority is profound insecurity. That's not what's happening with Wesker. His superiority isn't compensatory, it's structural. He doesn't feel superior to cover up feelings of inferiority. He feels superior because by every measurable standard available to him, he is superior. His IQ is genius level. His education is comprehensive and elite. His physical capabilities, even before viral enhancement, were exceptional due to the genetic selection and training he received. And after the prototype virus, he gains superhuman strength, speed, regeneration, and reflexes that put him so far beyond human norms that calling him human becomes taxonomically questionable. This creates a psychological situation that's profoundly unusual. When your superiority complex is continuously validated by reality, it doesn't stay a complex. It becomes your operational framework for understanding the world. Other people aren't your equals because they objectively aren't your equals in the domains you value: intelligence, capability, vision. These are the metrics that matter to Wesker, and he exceeds almost everyone in all of them. So the question isn't, why does he have a superiority complex? The question is, why wouldn't he? But here's where it tips from confidence into pathology. Healthy self-esteem, even in exceptionally capable people, includes recognition of shared humanity. A brilliant scientist can acknowledge their intellectual gifts while still recognizing that the janitor cleaning their lab is a person with intrinsic worth, with experiences and emotions as valid as their own. They can have confidence without contempt. Wesker never develops this. To him, the gap between himself and ordinary humans isn't just a difference in capability, it's a difference in kind. He's not a very smart human. He's something categorically different, and ordinary humans are to him what insects might be to ordinary humans. You can study them, you can use them, you might even find some of them momentarily interesting, but you don't consider them your equals, and you certainly don't feel guilty about stepping on them when they're in your way. This is where superiority complex crosses into what we'd clinically call narcissistic personality disorder, specifically the grandiose subtype. The DSM-5 describes this as a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. Wesker hits every criterion. Grandiose sense of self-importance, check. He sees himself as unique and special, destined to rule. Preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited power and success, check. His entire adult life is dedicated to accumulating power and enacting plans for global domination. Belief that they are special and can only be understood by other special people, check. He shows contempt for ordinary humans and only values individuals like Spencer or Birkin who operate on what he considers a comparable intellectual level, though even they are ultimately tools or obstacles to him. Requires excessive admiration. This one's more subtle with Wesker because he doesn't need external validation the way typical narcissists do. He's so confident in his own assessment of his worth that others' opinions are largely irrelevant. But there are moments, particularly in his interactions with Chris Redfield, where you see a need not for admiration exactly, but for recognition. He wants Chris to understand how thoroughly he's been surpassed, wants to demonstrate his superiority in ways that force acknowledgement. It's not quite the same as needing praise, but it's in the same family. He enjoys being witnessed in his superiority. Sense of entitlement, absolutely. Wesker believes he's entitled to rule, entitled to reshape humanity, entitled to decide who lives and dies based on genetic worth. Interpersonally exploitative, obviously. Every relationship he has is transactional, built on utility, lacks empathy completely. There's no evidence Wesker experiences empathy in any conventional sense. He can cognitively understand what others are feeling. He's smart enough to model their emotional states, but he doesn't feel with them. Their suffering doesn't register as something that matters beyond how it affects his plans. Envious of others or believes others are envious of him. The second part, definitely. He assumes people like Spencer or other umbrella higher ups are threatened by his capabilities, which, to be fair, they probably are. And arrogant behaviors and attitudes, that's his entire presentation. Severity level 5 for narcissistic pathology. It's total, defining, unshakable. But we need to go further because by Resident Evil 5, Wesker isn't just narcissistic. He's actively delusional in the clinical sense. He believes he's going to become a god, and I don't mean metaphorically. He literally plans to use the Ouroboros virus to ascend to a divine status, ruling over a new humanity that's been forcibly evolved through his intervention. He's not being hyperbolic when he talks about this. He means it. This is megalomania in the purest sense, delusions of grandeur so severe that they've detached from any realistic assessment of outcomes. Even acknowledging Wesker's capabilities, his plan is insane. Release a virus that will kill 90+% of humanity. Hope that the survivors are the genetically superior ones who'll become superhuman instead of turning into oil slick monsters, and then rule over them as a god king. The number of failure points in this plan is staggering. The likelihood that it would produce the outcome he wants is essentially zero. But he can't see that because his inflated self-assessment has reached the point where he genuinely believes his will and vision are sufficient to bend reality. Psychologically, this often happens when narcissism goes unchecked for long enough. If you spend decades being right about your superiority, never facing consequences for your actions, always managing to snatch victory from defeat through a combination of skill and luck, your sense of your own capabilities can inflate beyond realistic bounds. Wesker has been operating successfully as a traitor, a thief, and a mass murderer for years. He faked his death and came back stronger. He played multiple organizations against each other. He stayed ahead of both Umbrella and its rivals. Every time someone tried to stop him, he won. That track record creates a sense of invincibility, a belief that you're not just better than others, but operating by different rules entirely. This is the path from superiority complex to megalomania. It's incremental. Each success reinforces the core belief. Each failure, and Wesker does experience setbacks, is externalized or reframed. When things go wrong, it's because others failed him, because variables he couldn't control interfered, never because his assessment of himself or his plans was flawed. This kind of egocentric grandiosity, where the inflated self-image feels entirely natural and correct to the person experiencing it, is almost impossible to treat because the person doesn't see it as a problem. From inside Wesker's perspective, he's not delusional. He's simply seeing clearly what others are too limited to comprehend. Attachment pathology and instrumental relationships. Let's shift to examining Wesker's relationships because they reveal just how profoundly his psychology diverges from normal human functioning. Most people, even those with significant personality pathology, maintain at least some genuine attachments. They have people they care about, whose well-being matters to them independent of utility. Wesker doesn't. Every single relationship he forms is instrumental. People are tools, assets, threats, or obstacles, nothing more. This is what psychologists call severe attachment disorder, though even that term doesn't quite capture what's happening, because attachment disorder usually implies damage to the attachment system. Wesker's attachment system isn't damaged. It was never allowed to develop in the first place. From childhood, he was conditioned to view relationships through the lens of utility. Who is useful to my advancement? Who has knowledge I need? Who presents a threat to my goals? These are the only questions that matter. Emotional connection, loyalty, trust, these are weaknesses to be exploited in others, not qualities to cultivate in himself. His relationship with William Birkin is the closest Wesker probably comes to friendship, and even that is fundamentally transactional. They meet as teenagers, both identified as exceptional researchers within Umbrella's system. They work together on projects, they share information, there's a kind of camaraderie that forms between them. But examine it closely and you see the limits. Wesker values Birkin because Birkin is useful. He's brilliant, creative in ways that complement Wesker's more systematic approach. Their partnership is productive. But when Birkin becomes a liability, when his obsession with the G virus puts him at odds with Umbrella leadership, Wesker doesn't protect him. He doesn't intervene. He lets Birkin fall because their utility to each other has ended. When Birkin's obsession with the G virus puts him at odds with Umbrella leadership, Wesker doesn't intervene to protect him. When Umbrella's security forces are sent to eliminate Birkin and seize his research, Wesker attempts a rescue, but arrives too late. There's no indication this failure costs him anything emotionally beyond the loss of a useful colleague. This is someone he's worked with for years, possibly the closest thing to a friend he's ever had, and he signs the death warrant without apparent internal struggle. Because Birkin isn't a friend, Birkin is a colleague, a co-conspirator, an asset. When assets become liabilities, you eliminate them. It's not personal, it's practical. This pattern repeats across every relationship. His subordinates and stars, their test subjects and pawns. He sends them into the Spencer mansion knowing most will die because their deaths will provide combat data on Umbrella's bioweapons. He manipulates Barry Burton through threats to Barry's family, not with any particular cruelty, but with business-like efficiency. The threats are a tool to ensure compliance. When Barry becomes unreliable, Wesker adjusts his plans accordingly. There's no anger, no sense of betrayal, just recalculation. His interactions with Ada Wong show the same pattern. She's useful to him at certain points, possessing skills and access he needs. He works with her when their interests align, but there's zero indication of genuine care or trust. She's a mercenary. He's a megalomaniac. They use each other with full mutual understanding that loyalty extends exactly as far as utility. The moment that changes, the relationship ends. No hard feelings because there were no real feelings to begin with. The most psychologically revealing relationship might be the one between Wesker and Oswell Spencer. Spencer is Wesker's creator in the most literal sense. He designed the Wesker Children Project. He selected Albert specifically. He invested enormous resources into shaping him. And when Wesker discovers the full truth about his origins, his response isn't gratitude or even anger. It's contempt. He sees Spencer as a delusional old man who wanted to become a god but lacked the capability to actually achieve it. Spencer created Wesker to be his successor, his masterpiece, and Wesker's response to this is to hunt Spencer down and kill him, but not before making sure Spencer understands that his creation has surpassed him. This is particularly telling psychologically. Many people who discover they were raised as part of some grand experiment would experience identity crisis, would question their sense of self, would feel rage at being used. Wesker doesn't. He integrates the information instantly and without distress because it confirms what he already believed. Of course, he was specially selected. Of course, he was always destined for greatness. The only thing that bothers him is Spencer's implication that Wesker was meant to serve Spencer's vision. That's unacceptable. Wesker serves no one's vision but his own. His murder of Spencer is therefore both patricide and deicide. He's killing his creator and claiming that role for himself. The psychological symbolism is heavy. Wesker can't tolerate the idea that anyone, even the man who made him possible, has authority over him. So Spencer must die, and in dying must acknowledge Wesker's superiority. It's not enough to kill him. Spencer must know he's been surpassed. This need for the murdered father figure to witness and acknowledge the son's superiority is classic Oedipal psychology, but taken to a psychopathic extreme. Throughout all of this, there's no evidence Wesker experiences guilt, remorse, or meaningful emotional attachment to anyone. His nervous system isn't wired for it. The neural pathways that in most people generate empathic responses, that create emotional bonds, that make betrayal feel costly, those either never developed or were systematically conditioned out of functionality. What remains is pure instrumental rationality. People are objects with varying degrees of usefulness. You maintain relationships with useful objects and discard objects that are no longer useful. It's not evil in Wesker's experience. It's simply logical. Attachment pathology, severity level 5. Total absence of genuine emotional bonds. This isn't reactive attachment disorder, where trauma prevents someone from forming connections they desperately want. This is something colder, a psychology that never developed the capacity for attachment because it was engineered not to. Wesker doesn't feel lonely. He doesn't miss connection. He's alone at the center of his own universe and experiences that as the natural, correct state of existence. Everyone else is peripheral, satellites in orbit around him, held in place only as long as gravitational utility maintains the relationship. This makes him profoundly inhuman in a specific psychological sense. One of the defining features of human psychology is our need for connection, our capacity to bond with others in ways that transcend immediate utility. We maintain relationships that cost us resources. We sacrifice for people we love. We feel genuine distress when attachments are threatened. Wesker has none of this. He's been optimized for pure self-interest, and the result is a psychology that can pass for human in its intelligence and capability, but is fundamentally alien in its emotional architecture. The God complex and philosophical justification. We need to talk about the endpoint of all this, the fully developed God complex that defines Wesker by Resident Evil 5, and the philosophical framework he uses to justify what he's planning. Because Wesker doesn't see himself as a villain from inside his own perspective. He's not engaging in mass murder. He's conducting forced evolution, elevating humanity to its next stage, and the billions who will die in the process are acceptable losses, failed specimens who were going to die eventually anyway. This is where psychology intersects with philosophy, specifically with Nietzschean concepts of the Übermensch and social Darwinism. Wesker has constructed an entire worldview that positions him not just as superior, but as morally justified, even obligated to do what he's doing. Let's unpack that because it reveals how someone of high intelligence can arrive at monstrously evil conclusions through perfectly logical steps. Once you accept certain premises, the core philosophical influence is clearly Nietzsche, though filtered through multiple layers of misunderstanding and deliberate misappropriation. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the Overman or Superman, was meant as a creative ideal, a vision of humanity transcending its current limitations through the creation of new values. It wasn't meant as biological superiority or justification for genocide, but social Darwinists, eugenicists, and people like Wesker have always found Nietzsche useful because if you strip away the nuance and just focus on the Superman transcending the herd, you get a convenient justification for viewing most of humanity as expendable. Wesker reads as someone who's thoroughly internalized a bastardized version of this philosophy. In his worldview, humanity is weak, stagnant, held back by the mediocrity of the masses. The only way to progress is through radical selection, eliminating the unfit and elevating the worthy. He sees himself as the agent of this progress, the one with the vision and capability to actually enact what weaker men only theorize about. Spencer talked about creating gods but never had the stomach for what that required. Wesker does. This connects to his God complex, which by Resident Evil 5 is explicit and literal. He calls himself a god. He plans to rule over a new humanity as their god. This isn't megalomania in the sense of delusion. From his perspective, what is a god but a being of vastly superior power and intelligence who shapes the fate of lesser beings? He has the power, superhuman abilities that put him beyond human limitation. He has the intelligence, able to outthink and outmaneuver organizations and individuals. He has the vision, a plan to forcibly evolve humanity. And he has the will, the absolute certainty, and lack of moral restraint necessary to actually do it. By his own definition of godhood, he qualifies. The Ouroboros virus is his mechanism for apotheosis, both his own and humanity's. In his vision, the virus will act as a sorting mechanism. Those with superior genetics will bond with it, gain superhuman abilities, become the next stage of human evolution. Those who lack the necessary genetic profile will die, transformed into mindless monsters before being eliminated. It's eugenics through bioweapon, a global culling that will leave only the worthy, who will then form a new world under his guidance. Psychologically, this is where his megalomania reaches its apex. He genuinely believes this plan will work. He genuinely believes he has the right, even the obligation to do this. And he genuinely believes the result will be paradise, a world populated by superior beings who will recognize his supremacy and accept his rule. The number of assumptions and leaps of logic required to arrive at this conclusion is staggering, but Wesker doesn't see them as leaps. To him, each step follows logically from the last. Let's trace the logic as he would experience it. Premise 1. Humans are defined by their evolutionary capacity, their genetic fitness. Premise 2. Most humans are genetically mediocre, holding back the species' potential. Premise 3. I am genetically superior, proven by my survival of the prototype virus and my enhanced capabilities. Premise 4. Superior beings have the right and responsibility to guide or replace inferior beings. Conclusion: I am justified in forcibly evolving humanity, eliminating the unfit, and ruling over the survivors. Each premise is debatable or outright wrong, but if you accept them, the conclusion does follow. This is motivated reasoning on a civilizational scale. Wesker wants to be a god, so he constructs a philosophical framework that justifies that desire. He dresses up his narcissistic power fantasy in the language of evolution and progress. He tells himself he's serving the future of humanity, even as he plans to kill most of humanity to get there. This is what psychologists call moral disengagement, but taken to an extreme that makes typical examples seem quaint. Albert Bandura's research on moral disengagement identifies several mechanisms people use to commit harmful acts without experiencing guilt. Moral justification is one, where harmful conduct is made personally acceptable by portraying it as serving a higher purpose. Wesker does this constantly. He's not committing genocide, he's elevating the species. Euphemistic labeling is another, using sanitized language to make conduct sound less harmful. Wesker talks about natural selection and evolution rather than mass murder. Displacement of responsibility, where people view their actions as stemming from authorities rather than their own choices. Wesker inverts this. He takes full responsibility, which actually makes it psychologically easier for him because it confirms his agency and power. Dehumanization of victims is perhaps the most relevant mechanism. If you view your victims as less than fully human, their suffering matters less. Wesker views ordinary humans as categorically inferior, not just in capability, but in worth. They're failed specimens, evolutionary dead ends. Their deaths aren't tragedies, they're inevitable outcomes of the selection process he's implementing. This is how someone of high intelligence commits atrocities, by constructing frameworks where the atrocities stop looking like atrocities and start looking like necessary steps toward a greater good. The God complex, severity level 5, it's not a metaphor for Wesker, it's his operational reality by the end. He has deified himself in his own mind, and his entire psychology supports that deification. The manufactured superiority from childhood, the narcissistic pathology, the absence of empathic connection, the philosophical framework justifying his actions, all of it culminates in the genuine belief that he has transcended humanity and earned the right to reshape it in his image. What makes this particularly disturbing from a psychological standpoint is that Wesker isn't raving or incoherent. He's calm, articulate, precise in his thinking. His God complex isn't accompanied by the kind of disorganization you see in psychotic grandiosity. He's not hearing voices telling him he's God. He's arrived at that conclusion through what he experiences as rational analysis. This is organized, systematized, highly functional delusion, if we can even call it delusion when it's supported by superhuman capabilities and decades of successful manipulation. This is the psychology of the high-functioning megalomaniac, someone smart enough to construct seemingly rational justifications for monstrous goals, someone capable enough that their grandiose self-assessment has significant basis in reality, someone disconnected enough from normal human emotion that moral restraints don't apply. Wesker genuinely believes he's in the right. That's what makes him terrifying. He's not conflicted. He's not secretly aware that what he's doing is evil. From inside his own psychology, he's the hero of the story, the visionary who had the courage to do what was necessary for humanity's evolution, even when the short-sighted masses couldn't understand. The performance of humanity and emotional mimicry. One of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of Wesker is how effectively he performs humanity despite lacking the emotional infrastructure that makes most people human. He spent years as the captain of stars, working alongside people who trusted him, who considered him a colleague and friend. He maintained that cover perfectly. No one suspected what he actually was until the moment he revealed it. This requires examining what psychologists call masking or social camouflage, the ability to mimic appropriate emotional responses and social behaviors without actually experiencing the underlying emotions. This is common in individuals with antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy, and Wesker displays essentially every hallmark of psychopathy as defined by Robert Hare's PCL-R checklist. Let's go through it because the fit is nearly perfect. Glibness and superficial charm, absolutely. Wesker is articulate, confident, capable of presenting as professional and competent. He's not warm exactly, but he projects authority and capability that people respond to positively. Grandiose sense of self-worth. We've covered that extensively. Pathological lying, constantly. His entire existence is a performance, a carefully constructed lie about who and what he is. Need for stimulation and proneness to boredom. This manifests in his constant scheming. Wesker is always playing multiple games simultaneously, betraying everyone, pursuing grand plans. Someone with normal emotional range would find this exhausting. For Wesker, it's stimulation. The complexity keeps him engaged. Cunning and manipulative, defining characteristics. Everything he does involves manipulation, playing people and organizations against each other. Lack of remorse or guilt, total absence. There's no evidence anywhere across multiple games that Wesker experiences guilt for anything he's done. Shallow affect and lack of empathy, completely present. When Wesker displays emotion, it's theatrical rather than genuine. The anger he shows is performative, meant to intimidate or destabilize others. The satisfaction he expresses at his victories is real but shallow, disconnected from deeper emotional resonance. He experiences a kind of intellectual satisfaction at successful manipulation, but nothing deeper. Callousness and lack of empathy absolute. His inability to connect with others' suffering is total. Parasitic lifestyle not in the traditional sense, since Wesker is self-sufficient, but he absolutely uses others without reciprocation. Poor behavioral controls. This one's interesting because Wesker is usually very controlled, but under stress or when his superiority is challenged, particularly by Chris Redfield, you see breaks in that control. Moments where rage surfaces not as calculated performance but as genuine fury that someone inferior dares to resist him. Promiscuous sexual behavior. We don't have enough information about Wesker's personal life to assess this, though his total lack of genuine relationships suggests sex would be purely physical, if it occurs at all, another form of using others. Early behavioral problems unknown due to his manufactured childhood, but the Wesker Project conditioning likely suppressed typical childhood development anyway. Lack of realistic long-term goals. No, Wesker has very specific long-term goals, though they're megalomaniacal. Impulsivity? Generally no, he's a planner. But there are moments, particularly his final confrontation with Chris, where desperation and rage make him sloppy. Irresponsibility, not applicable in the traditional sense. Failure to accept responsibility for actions. He actually inverts this. Wesker takes full credit for everything he does, but frames it as justified rather than wrong. Many short-term relationships, yes. Every relationship is temporary and instrumental. Juvenile delinquency, unknown. Revocation of conditional release, not applicable. Criminal versatility, absolutely. Wesker commits every category of crime from theft to terrorism to crimes against humanity, using whatever methods serve his goals. Psychopathy, severity, level 5. Wesker is a textbook case of primary psychopathy, the organized, intelligent, high-functioning variant. But what makes him particularly interesting psychologically is how effectively he weaponizes this. Most psychopaths struggle to maintain long-term deception because maintaining the mask is cognitively demanding. You have to constantly monitor your behavior, remember what emotions you're supposed to display, in what contexts. Avoid the kinds of slip-ups that reveal the emptiness underneath. Wesker makes this look effortless. For years at Stars, he plays the role of competent, slightly distant, but ultimately trustworthy captain. He knows exactly how much warmth to display to avoid seeming cold, exactly how much concern to show to seem human without overplaying it. He participates in the social rituals the team dynamics, the professional relationships, and no one realizes they're interacting with someone who views them as test subjects and disposable assets. This is cognitive empathy divorced from affective empathy. Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand what someone else is thinking or feeling, to model their mental state. Affective empathy is actually feeling with them, experiencing emotional resonance with their emotional state. Most people have both. People with autism spectrum conditions sometimes have reduced cognitive empathy, but intact affective empathy. They care deeply about others but struggle to read social cues. Psychopaths have the opposite profile, high cognitive empathy. They're often excellent at reading people, but zero affective empathy. They understand what you're feeling but don't feel it with you. Wesker's cognitive empathy is exceptional. He's brilliant at reading people, understanding their motivations, predicting their responses. This makes him an extraordinarily effective manipulator. He knows exactly what buttons to push to get the responses he wants. With Barry, he identifies the pressure point, threats to family, and exploits it perfectly. With Chris, he understands that Chris's sense of duty and protection of others is what drives him. So Wesker structures their confrontations to threaten those Chris cares about, knowing it will destabilize his opponent emotionally. But there's no effective component. Wesker doesn't feel what others feel when he watches people die in the Spencer mansion, when he sends his STARS teammates into lethal situations, when he plans the death of billions. He experiences no emotional distress. He might experience intellectual satisfaction if things go according to plan, or analytical frustration if they don't, but the human cost is irrelevant to him except as data. How many test subjects died? Were the combat data collected useful? These are the questions that matter. This combination, brilliant cognitive empathy plus complete absence of affective empathy, is what makes Wesker so dangerous. He can predict and manipulate human behavior with extraordinary precision while being completely unburdened by moral restraint or emotional consequence. He's optimized for manipulation in a way that's genuinely inhuman. The performance extends to his entire presentation. The sunglasses aren't just an aesthetic choice, though they certainly contribute to his iconic look. They're a practical tool for masking. Human emotion is communicated heavily through the eyes. Micro expressions around the eyes, pupil dilation, the direction and intensity of gaze, all of these convey emotional information that most people read automatically. By hiding his eyes, Wesker removes one of the primary channels through which his emotional emptiness might be detected. People can't see the lack of warmth in his gaze, can't read the absence of genuine emotional response in his eyes. His voice is similarly controlled. That distinctive calm, slightly mocking tone he uses, it's carefully calibrated. Not so cold that it seems inhuman, but distant enough to discourage intimacy. The occasional displays of anger or satisfaction are theatrical, performed for effect. Listen to how he speaks, and you'll notice the emotions seem laid over the words rather than emerging from them organically. It's the vocal equivalent of someone painting emotions onto a blank surface. Even his body language is controlled. Wesker moves with precision, with economy. There's no nervous fidgeting, no unconscious self-soothing behaviors, none of the subtle signals most people leak constantly that reveal their emotional state. He's learned to still all of that, to present only what he chooses to present. This level of control is exhausting for most people to maintain, but for Wesker it's baseline. He's not suppressing his real emotions, he's simply performing the emotions others expect, while experiencing very little internally. This is what psychologists studying psychopathy called the mask of sanity. Hervey Cleckley coined that term to describe how psychopaths can appear not just normal, but often exceptionally capable and charming, hiding profound emotional emptiness behind a carefully constructed facade. Wesker's mask is particularly sophisticated because he has the intelligence and resources to maintain it perfectly, and because the emptiness underneath is so complete, there's essentially nothing pushing to emerge and disrupt the performance. But the mask does slip, and those moments are psychologically revealing. When does Wesker lose his carefully maintained control? When his superiority is effectively challenged. When Chris Redfield, someone Wesker has categorized as inferior, manages to not just survive but actively interfere with his plans repeatedly. Something breaks in Wesker's presentation. The calm superiority gives way to genuine rage, not performed anger meant to intimidate, but real fury that this inferior specimen dares to resist, dares to survive, dares to act as though he's Wesker's equal. This is narcissistic injury, the psychological term for what happens when a narcissist's grandiose self-image is contradicted by reality. For most narcissists, this might mean someone doesn't give them the admiration they expect, or criticizes them publicly, or succeeds where the narcissist failed. For Wesker, narcissistic injury occurs when his carefully constructed hierarchy is threatened, when someone he's categorized as beneath him refuses to stay beneath him. Chris Redfield becomes almost an obsession for Wesker precisely because Chris represents an ongoing narcissistic injury. Here is this ordinary human, not enhanced, not part of the Wesker project, not special in any objective way, and he keeps winning. He survives the mansion when most of Stars dies. He actively works to destroy Umbrella. He interferes with Wesker's plans repeatedly. And worst of all, in their final confrontation, Chris kills him. An inferior specimen permanently defeating a superior one is intolerable to Wesker's psychology. It can't be accepted because accepting it would mean acknowledging that his entire hierarchical worldview might be wrong. That's why Wesker's final moments are so psychologically significant. He's being defeated, actually losing, and instead of accepting reality, he becomes more unhinged, more desperate, more rage-filled. The mask is gone completely. What's revealed isn't humanity, it's the void, the emptiness that was always there, temporarily organized around the goal of dominance and godhood, now fragmenting as that organizing principle fails. He doesn't have a deeper self to fall back on, no values or connections that could provide meaning when the primary goal proves unreachable. There's just rage at a universe that didn't arrange itself according to his vision. Trauma, immunity, and the absence of PTSD. Here's something psychologically unusual about Wesker that's worth examining. Despite experiencing events that would traumatize most people, multiple near-death experiences, betrayals, the revelation that his entire identity was manufactured, Wesker shows zero signs of post-traumatic stress. This absence is significant because it reveals just how different his psychological architecture is from normal human functioning. Think about what Wesker experiences across the series. He's impaled by a tyrant, an injury that would kill any normal human. He injects himself with an experimental virus, having no certainty it will work, rather than kill him. He learns the full truth about the Wesker Project, that he was manufactured, that his entire childhood was a controlled experiment. He experiences repeated setbacks and betrayals as organizations he works with or against pursue their own agendas. Any one of these could be traumatic. Combined, they should leave significant psychological scarring, but they don't. There's no hypervigilance beyond his normal vigilance, no intrusive memories or flashbacks, no avoidance of trauma reminders, no negative alterations in cognition or mood, because his cognition and mood are already fundamentally different from normal baselines. No alterations in arousal and reactivity, because he has perfect control over his presentation at almost all times. This isn't resilience in the normal sense. Resilience implies experiencing distress but recovering from it, processing trauma, and integrating it in healthy ways. Wesker doesn't process trauma because he doesn't experience it as traumatic. Events that would shatter most people's sense of safety or self wash over him without leaving significant marks, because he lacks the emotional vulnerability that makes trauma possible. Let's take the impalement by the tyrant. From Wesker's perspective, this is mildly inconvenient. It forces him to activate his viral enhancements earlier than planned and stage his death. But there's no evidence he experiences fear during the attack, no panic, no psychological aftermath. He calculates, adapts, and moves forward. The physical injury is irrelevant because his enhanced healing handles it. The psychological impact is non-existent because he doesn't have the emotional architecture that would generate trauma responses. The revelation about the Wesker Project is similarly revealing. Many people who discover they were adopted or that their parentage isn't what they thought experience profound identity crisis. Questions about who they really are, whether their relationships were genuine, whether anything they believed about themselves is true. These questions can be existentially destabilizing. Wesker integrates the information instantly and without distress. He doesn't experience identity crisis because his identity is entirely self-generated anyway. Learning that Spencer selected him and shaped his development doesn't change anything fundamental about how Wesker sees himself. If anything, it provides confirmation. Of course he was specially selected. Of course resources were invested in his development. The revelation explains the superiority he's always felt, rather than contradicting any core belief. This is what psychologists might call emotional invulnerability, though that framing is somewhat misleading because it implies protection of something vulnerable underneath. Wesker isn't protecting his emotions. He fundamentally lacks the emotional depth that would need protection. You can't traumatize someone who doesn't form attachments to begin with. You can't shatter a sense of safety in someone who never felt existentially vulnerable. You can't create intrusive memories of horror in someone who experiences horror as interesting data. This absence of trauma response, severity level 5 in the sense that it's a complete absence of normal trauma psychology, actually contributes to Wesker's functionality as a villain. He can be defeated temporarily, set back, forced to adapt, and he simply recalculates and continues. There's no psychological accumulation of damage, no wearing down of his resolve or will, no moments where the weight of everything he's done crashes down on him because he doesn't experience weight. Actions don't have emotional mass for him. They're just actions, steps toward goals, entirely divorced from moral or emotional significance. This makes him nearly impossible to break psychologically. You can't threaten him with loss because he doesn't have genuine attachments to lose. You can't make him feel guilt because he doesn't experience guilt. You can't hope that the cumulative weight of his actions will eventually crush him because actions don't have weight in his psychology. The only way to stop Wesker is to kill him, and even that proves difficult given his enhancements. Psychological approaches to stopping him are fundamentally useless because there's no psychology to leverage. Compare this to someone like Ethan Winters, whose psychology is essentially trauma stacked on trauma, each new horror adding to the accumulated damage. Ethan can be psychologically understood through his wounds, his dissociation, his desperate attempts to protect the people he loves despite being shattered by what he's experienced. Wesker has no wounds, no fractures, no weak points in his psychological armor because the armor isn't protecting anything. It's the entire structure. He's been optimized for goal pursuit at the expense of everything that makes psychological vulnerability possible: power dynamics and the need for domination. We need to examine Wesker's relationship with power because it's central to his entire psychology. This isn't just about wanting power as a means to an end, like wanting money to buy things or wanting authority to implement policies. For Wesker, power is the end. Domination, superiority, control over others. These aren't tools for achieving goals. They are the goals. Everything else is justification. In psychological terms, this is about power motivation taken to pathological extremes. David McClelland's research on achievement, affiliation, and power motivation identified power motivation as the need to have impact on others, to be strong and influential. In healthy forms, this might manifest as wanting to lead, to inspire, to create change in the world. In pathological forms, it becomes domination for its own sake, crushing others to prove your superiority, needing to control and rule because the alternative, being equal or subordinate, is psychologically intolerable. Wesker's power motivation is entirely pathological. Every interaction is a dominance game. Even when he's working with others toward supposedly shared goals, he needs to establish superiority. With Birkin, he's the slightly superior partner, the one with greater vision even if Birkin has comparable intelligence. With Ada, he's the employer, the one with resources and information she needs. With his subordinates in various organizations, he's always several levels above them in the hierarchy, holding their lives in his hands. This need for domination manifests most clearly in his interactions with Chris Redfield. Chris is Wesker's nemesis, not because Chris poses the greatest threat, there are other characters with comparable capability, but because Chris refuses to acknowledge Wesker's superiority. Every time they meet, Chris treats Wesker as an enemy to be defeated, not as a superior being to be feared or worshipped. This drives Wesker to escalate, to demonstrate his superiority more dramatically, to crush Chris in ways that will force acknowledgement. But Chris keeps surviving, keeps resisting, and this creates a feedback loop where Wesker's need to dominate intensifies. By Resident Evil 5, the entire plan, releasing Ouroboros globally, forcing human evolution, ascending to godhood, is tangled up with his need to finally, definitively prove his superiority over Chris. It's not just about reshaping humanity anymore, though that's the stated goal. It's about making Chris witness that reshaping, making him understand how completely he's been surpassed, and then killing him from a position of absolute superiority. This is domination as psychological need rather than strategic choice. A purely rational actor would recognize Chris as a persistent threat and eliminate him efficiently at the first opportunity. Wesker doesn't. He toys with Chris, allows him to live, creates scenarios where Chris can witness Wesker's power before being defeated. This is the behavior of someone who needs not just to win, but to be seen winning, to have their superiority acknowledged by the person they're dominating. It's similar to the psychology of certain serial killers who need their victims to understand what's happening, to feel the killer's power and superiority before dying. The death isn't enough. The victim's awareness of the power dynamic, their fear and helplessness, that's what satisfies the psychological need. Wesker operates on a much grander scale, but the underlying psychology is comparable. He doesn't just want to kill Chris or defeat him. He wants Chris to understand, to acknowledge, to be crushed psychologically as well as physically. This need for domination also explains Wesker's theatrical presentation, the monologues explaining his plans, the dramatic reveals, the way he structures confrontations as opportunities to demonstrate superiority. None of this is strategically optimal. A smart villain would work in secrecy, reveal nothing, strike without warning, but that wouldn't satisfy the need for recognition. Wesker needs others to know what he's doing, to understand the scope of his plans, to be awed or terrified by his capabilities. This is where his narcissism and power motivation intersect. The grandiose self-image needs external confirmation, not because Wesker doubts himself, but because domination isn't complete until the dominated acknowledge it. It's not enough to be superior. Others must recognize and submit to that superiority. Only then is the hierarchy properly established. The tragedy, if we can call it that, is that this need can never be truly satisfied. There's always another challenge, another person who doesn't properly acknowledge Wesker's superiority, another situation where he has to prove himself again. The goalpost keeps moving because the need isn't really about external validation. It's a psychological hunger that can't be filled. Even if Wesker had succeeded in becoming God King of a new humanity, he would have found some way to feel unsatisfied, some group that didn't worship him sufficiently, some threat to his absolute dominance that would require crushing. This is the psychology of tyranny. Not tyranny as a political system, but as a psychological compulsion. The need to dominate is never satisfied by domination because it arises from internal emptiness, not external circumstances. Wesker's entire grand vision, reshaping humanity, forcing evolution, becoming a god, it's all ultimately about trying to fill a void that can't be filled, because it's the void that fills the space where a normal human psychology would be. Power, motivation, pathology, severity level 5. It's not just strong, it's the entire organizing principle of his psychology. Every goal, every plan, every interaction is ultimately about establishing and maintaining dominance. This makes him predictable in some ways. Chris exploits this in their final battle, using Wesker's need to demonstrate superiority against him, but it also makes him relentless. As long as Wesker is alive, he'll keep pursuing power because he has nothing else. No relationships to value, no alternative sources of meaning or satisfaction, only the endless, insatiable need to dominate, to control, to prove superiority that he already believes but can never quite convince the universe to acknowledge sufficiently. Philosophical corruption and misappropriated Nietzsche. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth exploring in depth because Wesker's philosophy reveals how intelligence divorced from empathy can create moral monsters. He's clearly influenced by Nietzschean concepts, particularly the Übermensch and the will to power, but he's misunderstood or deliberately corrupted these ideas in ways that are psychologically revealing. Nietzsche's Übermensch was never meant as biological superiority or justification for genocide. It was a creative ideal, the idea that humanity could transcend its current state by creating new values, by becoming more than what we currently are through philosophical and artistic development. The Übermensch would be someone who creates meaning in a universe Nietzsche saw as meaningless after the death of God, someone who affirms life rather than seeking escape into comforting lies. Wesker takes this concept and strips it of everything except might makes right. In his interpretation, the Übermensch is simply the strong dominating the weak, the superior replacing the inferior. He misses or ignores everything about creating values, about affirming life, about the artistic and philosophical dimensions. What he latches onto is just the hierarchy, the idea that some are higher and some are lower, and the higher have no obligation to the lower. This is social Darwinism, which ironically is also a corruption of Darwin's actual theory. Darwin described natural selection as a natural process, not a moral imperative. He wasn't saying the strong should dominate the weak. He was describing how evolution actually works through differential survival and reproduction. Social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer took these descriptive observations and turned them into prescriptive philosophy. Might makes, right becomes nature's law, becomes how we should organize society. Wesker has absorbed this corrupted philosophy completely. In his worldview, natural selection is good, and anything that interferes with it is bad. The weak should die, the strong should thrive and rule. This is natural law, and attempting to protect the weak through social support or medical advancement is actually violation of natural order, keeping inferior specimens alive when nature would cull them. This philosophy is psychologically convenient for Wesker because it justifies everything he wants to do anyway. He wants power and domination. And look, here's a philosophy that says that's actually good and natural. He wants to eliminate most of humanity. And look, here's a framework that frames that as forced evolution rather than genocide. He wants to rule as a god, and look, the Übermensch concept can be twisted into justification for that. This is motivated reasoning at the philosophical level. He's not genuinely exploring these ideas and arriving at uncomfortable conclusions. He's starting with the conclusions he wants. Superiority justifies domination. Might makes right, I should rule. And then finding philosophical frameworks that can be twisted to support those conclusions. The philosophy isn't driving his actions. His actions are driving his selection and interpretation of philosophy. But here's what's psychologically interesting. Wesker is smart enough to know he's doing this. He has the intellectual capacity to understand Nietzsche properly, to recognize that social Darwinism is widely rejected by actual biologists and philosophers, to see that his worldview is self-serving justification rather than objective truth. But he doesn't care. The philosophy is a tool, just like everything else. It's useful for framing his goals in ways that sound grand and meaningful, rather than admitting they arise from pathological narcissism and power hunger. This is where we see the intersection of high intelligence and moral bankruptcy. Someone less intelligent might actually believe their corrupted philosophy, might genuinely think they've discovered truth. Wesker is smart enough to know better, but chooses the comfortable lie because it serves his purposes. This is more culpable in some ways than simple belief because it's conscious, deliberate manipulation of ideas for self-serving ends. His speeches about human evolution and natural selection are performances, not genuine philosophical positions. He's playing a role, the visionary who sees harsh truths others are too weak to accept. This framing makes him the hero in his own narrative, the only one brave enough to do what evolution demands. But strip away the philosophical window dressing, and what remains is simple: you have power, you want more power, you'll kill anyone in your way, and you've constructed elaborate justification so you don't have to see yourself as the monster you obviously are. Except, and this is the final psychological twist, Wesker doesn't actually experience himself as a monster. The justifications work, at least on the surface. He's so committed to the performance that it's become his reality. He genuinely believes or has convinced himself so thoroughly that it amounts to the same thing that he's serving evolution, that his actions are justified, that the billions who will die in his plan are acceptable losses in service of humanity's advancement. This is cognitive dissonance resolution taken to extremes. When your actions contradict your self-image, you experience psychological discomfort. Most people resolve this by changing either their actions or their self-image to bring them into alignment. Wesker resolves it by constructing an entire philosophical framework where mass murder becomes forced evolution, where tyranny becomes guidance, where his pathological need for power becomes noble service to humanity's future. The philosophy is simultaneously window dressing and genuine belief, performance, and reality. He's smart enough to know he's justifying his desires, but invested enough in the justification that it's become psychologically real. This kind of motivated self-deception is surprisingly common in intelligent people who commit atrocities. They construct elaborate rationales that let them see themselves as heroes even while doing monstrous things. Wesker is just an extreme example, but the underlying psychology is depressingly human, or at least human in its capacity for self-deception, if not in its emotional emptiness. The Chris Redfield obsession and narcissistic fixation. There's something deeply psychological happening in Wesker's fixation on Chris Redfield that goes beyond simple hero-villain dynamics. Chris becomes an obsession for Wesker, and that obsession reveals cracks in the otherwise seamless superiority complex. Because if Wesker truly believed in his own supremacy with total confidence, Chris wouldn't matter. He'd be dealt with efficiently and forgotten, but that's not what happens. Instead, Chris becomes a recurring presence in Wesker's plans, someone Wesker simultaneously dismisses as inferior and cannot stop thinking about. This is what psychologists call a narcissistic fixation, where a narcissist becomes obsessed with someone who threatens their self-image. It's not about the person being an actual threat in objective terms. It's about what that person represents psychologically. Chris represents everything Wesker's worldview says shouldn't be possible. Here is an ordinary human, no genetic enhancement, no viral upgrades, no special selection from childhood. Just a guy with military training and stubborn determination, and he keeps surviving, keeps fighting, keeps interfering with Wesker's plans. Every time Chris survives an encounter with Wesker, it creates cognitive dissonance. Wesker's worldview says the superior being should always triumph over the inferior, but Chris, the supposed inferior specimen, keeps not dying. Wesker can explain away individual instances, luck, interference by others, incomplete information, but as the pattern repeats, the explanations wear thin. At some point, the evidence suggests that maybe Chris isn't as inferior as Wesker needs him to be, or worse, maybe Wesker isn't as superior as he believes. That second possibility is psychologically intolerable. Wesker's entire identity is built on superiority. Acknowledging that an unenhanced human could be as equal or better would require dismantling his entire self-concept. So instead of adjusting his worldview to accommodate contradictory evidence, Wesker doubles down. Chris becomes not just an enemy, but a personal affront, someone whose continued existence is an insult that must be corrected through increasingly elaborate demonstrations of superiority. This is why Wesker doesn't just kill Chris when he has opportunities. In their confrontations, there are multiple moments where Wesker could end it efficiently, but he doesn't. He monologues, he demonstrates his power. He creates scenarios where Chris can witness his superiority before being defeated. Because killing Chris isn't enough. Chris must understand his inferiority, must acknowledge Wesker's supremacy, must be psychologically crushed before being physically eliminated. This need transforms Chris from threat to mirror. Wesker sees himself reflected in Chris's resistance, and what he sees threatens his self-image. So he keeps trying to reshape that reflection into something that confirms rather than contradicts his superiority. Every encounter becomes an attempt to finally make Chris acknowledge what Wesker needs to be true. The psychological dynamic is almost intimate in its intensity, though not in any affectionate sense. It's the intimacy of obsession, where another person becomes so entangled in your psychological landscape that they're no longer really themselves. They're a symbol of everything you need to prove or deny. Chris probably doesn't think about Wesker with anything approaching the same intensity. To Chris, Wesker is a dangerous enemy who needs to be stopped, but he's just one of many threats Chris has faced. To Wesker, Chris becomes something much more significant, the one piece of evidence that won't fit into his carefully constructed worldview. This asymmetry is itself revealing. Wesker thinks about Chris constantly, structures plans around defeating him, experiences what might be the closest thing to genuine emotion he's capable of when Chris's name comes up. Chris is doing his job, stopping bioterrorists, and Wesker happens to be one of them. The fact that Wesker can't see this asymmetry, can't recognize that his fixation is disproportionate, shows how distorted his perspective has become. By Resident Evil 5, the obsession reaches its peak. Wesker's plan to release Ouroboros globally is ostensibly about forced evolution, but psychologically it's at least partially about Chris. He wants Chris to witness the plan succeeding, wants to defeat Chris in the context of this grand achievement. The final confrontation isn't just about stopping a bioterrorist plot, it's the culmination of Wesker's years-long need to prove his superiority to this one specific person. And when he loses, when Chris actually kills him, the psychological impact is visible even through Wesker's usual control. The rage that emerges isn't the calculated anger he sometimes performs. It's genuine fury, perhaps the most authentic emotion Wesker displays in the entire series. Because losing to Chris isn't just defeat, it's the complete collapse of his worldview. Everything he believed about superiority, about natural selection, about the strong inevitably triumphing over the weak, it's all contradicted by this one outcome. The inferior specimen won, the superior being lost, and Wesker cannot integrate that information, cannot accept it, cannot survive it psychologically even as his physical form is destroyed. The Chris fixation, severity level 4. It's not quite 5 because there are periods where Wesker focuses on other goals and Chris recedes into the background. But it's severe enough that it ultimately contributes to his defeat. A more rational villain would recognize Chris as dangerous and either recruit him or eliminate him efficiently. Wesker can't do either because Chris isn't really a tactical problem to be solved. He's a psychological wound that keeps reopening, a challenge to Wesker's self-image that transforms a capable enemy into an obsessive fixation. This is one of the few human elements in Wesker's psychology, and ironically it's the thing that destroys him. His inhuman lack of empathy makes him effective and ruthless. But his very human narcissistic need for recognition, for acknowledgement of his superiority, creates a vulnerability. Chris doesn't need to be stronger or smarter than Wesker to defeat him. He just needs to survive long enough and resist consistently enough that Wesker's fixation becomes a liability, making him predictable, making him take unnecessary risks, making him vulnerable in ways he would never be if he could just let it go and move on. The illusion of control and calculated risk-taking. One of the most consistent patterns in Wesker's behavior is his belief that he has control over situations that are actually far more chaotic than he recognizes. He's an extraordinary planner, genuinely brilliant at manipulating complex situations with multiple variables. But his success in doing this has created an illusion of control that exceeds his actual capability. And this illusion drives increasingly reckless decision-making disguised as calculated risk. Let's examine key moments where this manifests. The Spencer Mansion incident is a good starting point. Wesker's plan involves sending his STARS team into a facility full of bioweapons to gather combat data, then faking his death and escaping with the data. On paper, it's a solid plan. He has inside knowledge. He's orchestrated the scenario. He's accounted for most variables. But the plan requires extraordinary precision and luck to actually work. The tyrant impales him. This wasn't supposed to happen, or at least wasn't the optimal outcome. Wesker is forced to inject himself with the prototype virus without complete certainty it will work, relying on his genetic profile being compatible. If the virus doesn't take, he dies. If it takes wrong, he becomes a monster and loses himself. He's gambling with his existence based on Spencer's promises about his genetic suitability, and Spencer has already proven to be a manipulative liar who views the Wesker children as experiments. But it works. The virus grants him superhuman abilities. He survives, and from his perspective, this confirms that his risk assessment was correct, except it wasn't. He got lucky. The virus could have killed him or transformed him into something without consciousness. But because he survived, Wesker interprets the outcome as proof of his superiority and his ability to control outcomes, rather than acknowledging the role of chance. This pattern repeats. Every time Wesker takes an enormous risk and survives, it reinforces his belief in his own control. He betrays Umbrella and survives. He works with multiple rival organizations simultaneously and stays ahead of all of them. He infiltrates and manipulates complex situations that should be beyond any one person's ability to manage, and he keeps winning, at least in the short term. The psychological effect is to inflate his sense of control beyond realistic bounds. This is what psychologists call the illusion of control, the tendency to overestimate one's ability to control events, especially when you've experienced success in the past. It's been studied extensively in gambling, where people who win early tend to believe they have some special ability or system that makes them likely to win again, when the reality is randomness or simple luck. Wesker experiences this on a much grander scale. His early successes weren't pure luck. He is genuinely brilliant and capable, but they also involve factors outside his control: genetic compatibility with the virus, other people making choices he could influence but not determine, technological limitations in his enemy's ability to track him. A more realistic assessment would acknowledge these limitations. Wesker doesn't. Each success becomes proof of his ability to shape outcomes through will and intelligence alone. This drives his risk-taking to absurd levels by Resident Evil 5. His plan to release Ouroboros globally has catastrophic failure points. The virus doesn't work consistently. Most people exposed to it die horribly, or transform into monsters rather than achieving the superior evolution he envisions. The global logistics of releasing it are staggeringly complex. The likelihood of achieving his stated goal, a new humanity of evolved, superior beings under his rule, is essentially zero. Any realistic analysis would recognize this plan as effectively impossible. But Wesker doesn't see it that way. He's accounted for the variables he considers relevant. He has the virus. He has the delivery mechanism. He has the power to implement the plan. In his assessment, these factors are sufficient because he's the one implementing it, and his track record says he succeeds at complex manipulations. The fact that this particular manipulation is orders of magnitude more complex than anything he's attempted before doesn't register as adequately increasing the risk. This is the God complex manifesting as strategic blindness. He's so convinced of his ability to control outcomes that he stops accurately assessing risk. The plan will work because he wills it to work. The universe will align because he's superior enough to force alignment. This isn't rational calculation anymore. It's magical thinking dressed up in scientific language. The psychological mechanism here is what Daniel Kahneman calls the planning fallacy, where people underestimate how long tasks will take or how difficult they'll be, combined with overconfidence bias, where high performers tend to overestimate their actual capabilities. Wesker is a high performer, genuinely exceptional, so his overconfidence is anchored in real capability. But the gap between his actual ability and his assessed ability has grown so large that his risk assessment has become functionally delusional. A psychologically healthy person would have advisors, would seek second opinions, would test assumptions against critical analysis. Wesker doesn't. He surrounded himself with subordinates rather than equals, people who implement his plans rather than questioning them. This is partially by necessity. He can't trust anyone with complete information because anyone could betray him. But it's also psychological. He doesn't want his plans questioned because questioning them would imply his assessment could be wrong, and acknowledging fallibility contradicts the superiority complex that defines him. So he charges forward with plans that are increasingly detached from realistic possibility, convinced that his will and intelligence are sufficient to impose his vision on reality. And the tragedy, again, if we can call it that, is that he's successful enough for long enough that he never gets the feedback that might correct this trajectory. Every near miss becomes proof of his skill at navigating danger. Every adjustment he makes when plans go sideways becomes evidence of his adaptability, rather than evidence that his initial planning was inadequate. By the time he's injecting himself with massive doses of Ouroboros, trying to achieve a perfect fusion with the virus that will make him truly godlike, he's so disconnected from realistic risk assessment that he's essentially committing elaborate suicide while believing he's achieving apotheosis. The calculated risk-taker has become a reckless gambler who's convinced he can't lose because he's never experienced a loss he couldn't explain away or recover from. Illusion of control severity, level 4. It's not quite 5 because there are domains where Wesker is still capable of realistic assessment, tactical situations where his analysis remains sharp, but strategically in terms of his grand plans and long-term vision, his assessment is profoundly skewed. He believes he has far more control than he actually does, and that belief drives decision-making that becomes increasingly divorced from reality, ultimately contributing to his downfall, absence of growth, and psychological stagnation. Here's something that distinguishes Wesker from more complex villains. He doesn't grow, he doesn't change, he doesn't learn anything meaningful across the entire arc of his story beyond tactical adaptations. His psychology at the end is essentially identical to his psychology at the beginning, just more extreme. This absence of development is itself psychologically significant because it reveals just how rigid his personality structure is. Most people, even those with significant personality disorders, show some change over time. Life experiences shape us. Failures force adaptation. Our relationships, even failed ones, leave marks. We grow for better or worse because human psychology is somewhat plastic, capable of reorganizing in response to experience. Wesker doesn't. He's psychologically locked into patterns established in childhood, and nothing that happens to him produces meaningful change. Think about what he experiences that should produce growth, or at least change. He's betrayed by the organization he worked for. He discovers his entire childhood was a controlled experiment. He dies, sort of, and is resurrected through viral enhancement. He achieves superhuman abilities that put him beyond human limitation. He forms and breaks alliances with multiple organizations. He confronts people from his past, fights battles, faces setbacks. Any one of these could be transformative for someone with normal psychology. Wesker integrates none of it in ways that produce change. He absorbs tactical lessons, learns what worked and what didn't, adjusts his approach accordingly. But his fundamental psychology remains frozen. He's still pursuing superiority and dominance, still experiencing others as tools or obstacles, still convinced of his rightful place as ruler over inferior beings. The content of his plans evolves, the scope increases, but the underlying patterns are identical from his time with stars through his final confrontation with Chris. This psychological rigidity is characteristic of severe personality disorders, particularly psychopathy and narcissistic personality disorder. The personality structure is so deeply established, so egosyntonic, meaning it feels natural and correct to the person, that it's essentially immune to modification through experience. Therapy for severe personality disorders is extraordinarily difficult, often impossible, because the person doesn't see their patterns as problematic. From their perspective, the world is wrong, not them. Wesker would be completely unreachable through any therapeutic intervention, not that anyone tries. But imagine attempting it hypothetically. A therapist would need to help him recognize that his patterns are maladaptive, that his view of others as inferior is a cognitive distortion, that his pursuit of domination serves no real goal beyond feeding an insatiable need that can't ever be satisfied. Every single one of these recognitions would require Wesker to acknowledge fundamental flaws in his self-concept, to admit that the superiority he's built his entire identity around might be compensatory or delusional. He would never do that. The defenses are too strong, too integral to his functioning. Admitting those things would essentially require psychological suicide, the complete dismantling of his sense of self. And unlike someone whose destructive patterns make them genuinely miserable, creating motivation to change, Wesker is perfectly satisfied with his psychology. He doesn't experience his lack of empathy as a deficit. He doesn't feel lonely or wish for genuine connection. He experiences his superiority as fact and his pursuit of power as meaningful. There's no internal pressure toward change. This is what psychological stagnation looks like in someone highly functional. He's not deteriorating in capability. His intelligence and tactical skill remain sharp, but he's not growing in any direction that matters psychologically. He's essentially the same person at 40 that he was at 20, just with more resources and more elaborate plans. The core patterns, superiority, manipulation, dominance, power-seeking, are completely unchanged. This stagnation contrasts sharply with protagonists like Chris or Jill, who clearly develop across the series. They process trauma, form deeper relationships, grow in capability and wisdom. Their experiences change them in ways both positive and negative. They're dynamic characters in the psychological sense, not just the narrative sense. Wesker is utterly static. He's a fixed point around which events revolve, but he remains fundamentally unchanged by those events. From a certain perspective, this makes him profoundly tragic, though he'd reject that framing. He's trapped in patterns established before he had any choice in the matter, manufactured to be exactly what he is, and completely unable to become anything else. He has superhuman power, but no freedom in the way that matters most. The freedom to choose who you are rather than being determined by conditioning and inflexible personality structure. But from his own perspective, this isn't tragedy. It's destiny fulfilled. He is what he was always meant to be, and he pursues that nature to its ultimate conclusion. The inability to grow is experienced as consistency of purpose. The rigid patterns are experienced as unshakable conviction. What looks like stagnation from outside feels like perfect self realization from within. Psychological rigidity and absence of growth, severity level 5, it's complete, defining, absolute. Wesker is perhaps the most psychologically static major character in the Resident Evil series, and that stasis is both his greatest strength as a villain. He's utterly predictable once you understand his patterns, and his ultimate weakness. Those same patterns make him exploitable by someone like Chris, who learns to use Wesker's rigidity against him. The final confrontation and psychological disintegration. Wesker's death is psychologically significant because it's one of the few moments where we see genuine disintegration of his carefully maintained control. The mask doesn't just slip, it shatters completely. What emerges is raw, unfiltered rage and desperation that reveals what's underneath his godlike composure, which is, paradoxically, nothing but the desperate need to maintain that composure. In the final battle of Resident Evil 5, Wesker has been repeatedly frustrated by Chris and his partner Shiva. His plan is collapsing. The Ouroboros virus isn't producing the results he expected. He's been physically damaged in ways that his regeneration is struggling to keep up with. And Chris, the inferior specimen who should have died years ago, is still here, still fighting, still refusing to acknowledge Wesker's superiority. This creates a kind of psychological emergency. Wesker's entire identity is built on being in control, being superior, being the one who dominates and wins. Having that identity contradicted by reality creates cognitive dissonance so severe that his usual defense mechanisms, rationalization, externalization of blame, recalculation, and adaptation, can't keep up. The evidence of his failure is too immediate and too overwhelming to explain away. Watch how he responds. The calculated calm evaporates. The theatrical superiority is replaced with something rawer. He becomes increasingly desperate, injecting himself with more Ouroboros in an attempt to achieve the godlike power he's been promising himself. This is psychological panic manifesting as escalation. If the plan isn't working, make it bigger. If the power isn't sufficient, get more power. If the universe isn't acknowledging your superiority, force it to through sheer will and enhancement. But the additional Ouroboros backfires. Instead of making him godlike, it destabilizes him, creates mutations he can't control. His body starts to betray him in the most literal sense, and this is psychologically devastating because Wesker's control over his enhanced body has been one of the core proofs of his superiority. He's beyond human limitation, stronger and faster and more durable than baseline humans could ever be. When that control slips, when his body becomes monstrous rather than superhuman, it contradicts a fundamental aspect of his self-image. The rage that emerges in these final moments isn't strategic. It's not performed to intimidate opponents. It's genuine fury at a universe that isn't cooperating with his vision. How dare Chris survive? How dare the virus not work perfectly? How dare reality not arrange itself according to Wesker's will? This is narcissistic rage, the specific kind of anger that narcissists experience when their grandiose self-image is contradicted by reality. Most narcissists experience narcissistic rage in relatively small doses. Someone doesn't give them the admiration they expect. They explode in disproportionate anger. Wesker experiences it at civilizational scale. His entire plan to reshape humanity has failed. His superiority has been effectively challenged by someone he categorized as inferior. His godhood is being denied not by other gods, but by ordinary humans with conventional weapons. The rage is proportional to the magnitude of the narcissistic injury. What's psychologically revealing is that even in these final moments, Wesker doesn't show genuine fear or acceptance. He doesn't have a moment of clarity where he recognizes his mistakes or questions his worldview. He just becomes more desperate, more enraged, more insistent that this can't be happening because it contradicts who he is. The inability to integrate contradictory evidence, even in the face of death, shows just how rigid his psychology has become. When he finally dies, destroyed by Chris and Shiva, there's no catharsis or revelation. He just keeps fighting until he physically can't anymore, and then he's gone. No famous last words acknowledging his defeat or Chris's strength. No moment of the villain recognizing the hero's worth. Just rage and desperation until the end, unable to accept what's happening even as it happens. This contrasts with more psychologically complex villains who might have moments of recognition or acceptance in their final scenes. They see what they've become, acknowledge what they've lost, maybe express regret, or at least understanding. Wesker has nothing like that. He dies as he lived, absolutely convinced of his superiority, enraged that reality didn't align with his vision, unable to grow or change even when facing the ultimate evidence that his worldview was flawed. The psychological disintegration in his final moments, severity level 5 in the sense that it's total breakdown of his usual control. But it's important to understand that what disintegrates isn't revealing a healthier or more human self underneath. There is no hidden Wesker who was suppressed by the superiority complex. The disintegration reveals that the superiority complex was essentially the entirety of his psychology. When it breaks, there's nothing else there, just rage and emptiness and desperate need for dominance that can't be satisfied. This is perhaps the ultimate tragedy of Wesker's psychology, if we're going to use that framing. He spent his entire life pursuing something that could never satisfy him, building an identity around superiority that isolated him from anything resembling genuine human experience. And when he finally faced the collapse of that identity, he had nothing to fall back on, no relationships that mattered, no values beyond power, no sense of self that wasn't wrapped up in domination, just a brilliant, capable mind trapped in patterns established in childhood, unable to escape them even as they led inexorably to his destruction. Conclusion: the manufactured monster. So what do we make of Albert Wesker from a psychological perspective? We're looking at someone who was deliberately created to be exactly what he became, a brilliant, ruthless, superhuman sociopath with delusions of godhood. The Wesker Children Project succeeded in its primary goal, producing someone capable of surviving viral enhancement and becoming something beyond human. But it also produced a psychology so damaged, though Wesker would reject that framing, that the end result was a highly functional monster. Every psychological framework we've examined, the manufactured identity, the narcissistic pathology, the complete absence of empathy and genuine attachment, the philosophical justifications for genocide, the God complex, the obsessive fixation on Chris, the illusion of control, the complete psychological rigidity, all of these interlock to create someone who's simultaneously fascinating and horrifying to analyze. Wesker is fascinating because he's intelligent, articulate, capable of extraordinary planning and manipulation. He's not a mindless monster or a cackling villain. He's thoughtful, strategic, able to construct elaborate justifications for his actions. He speaks eloquently about human evolution and the future of the species. He's the kind of villain who makes you think, at least briefly, about whether he might have a point about humanity's limitations and the need for radical change. But he's horrifying when you examine what's actually underneath that articulate presentation. There's no genuine philosophy, just self-serving justification for pathological power hunger. There's no vision for a better future, just megalomania dressed up in evolutionary language. There's no tragic complexity, no hidden humanity struggling against the monster, just manufactured superiority and narcissistic need for domination taken to their logical extremes. From a clinical perspective, Wesker checks essentially every box for severe personality pathology: primary psychopathy, grandiose narcissistic personality disorder, paranoid personality features in his inability to trust anyone, antisocial personality disorder in his complete disregard for laws and others' rights. If you could get him to sit still for assessment, which you couldn't because he'd view it as beneath him, he'd likely score in the most severe ranges on every assessment tool for personality disorder and psychopathy. But what makes him psychologically unique isn't just the severity of his pathology, it's how functional he is despite or because of it. Most people with personality pathology, this severe struggle with basic life functioning. They can't maintain employment, can't sustain relationships, even instrumental funds, can't achieve long-term goals because their patterns are too destructive. Wesker doesn't have these problems. He's extraordinarily successful by conventional measures, at least until his final defeat. He accumulates power, resources, knowledge. He manipulates complex situations with multiple stakeholders. He adapts to setbacks and continues pursuing his goals across decades. This functionality is partially due to his extraordinary intelligence, but it's also because his pathology was specifically engineered to be functional. The Wesker Project didn't just create someone genetically superior, it created someone psychologically optimized for survival and advancement in competitive, hostile environments. Empathy is a weakness when everyone around you is a potential threat or tool. Attachment is a liability when relationships are temporary and strategic. Moral restraint is a handicap when your goals require ruthlessness. Normal human psychology has features that make us vulnerable in the kinds of environments Wesker operates in. His psychology has had those features systematically removed. The result is something that can pass for human, that has human intelligence and human appearance, and can perform human social behaviors when necessary, but is fundamentally not human in the psychological sense. Wesker is what you get when you take human cognitive capabilities and strip away everything that makes human psychology actually human. The empathy, the attachment, the moral sense, the capacity for growth and change, all gone. What remains is pure instrumental rationality in service of pathological goals. And here's the thing that should probably concern us. Wesker is fictional, obviously, but the psychology isn't entirely fictional. There are real people who have similar patterns, not usually to this extreme, but in the same basic family. High-functioning psychopaths exist. People with severe narcissistic pathology who achieve positions of power exist. People who've had their empathy systematically conditioned out of them through abuse or training exist. Wesker is an exaggerated, dramatized version of psychology that has real-world analogs. What Resident Evil does by creating Wesker is show us what that psychology looks like when taken to its logical extreme and given superhuman power. It's a thought experiment. What happens when someone with this constellation of traits gets exactly what they want? What happens when the narcissistic fantasy of godhood comes close to realization? The answer the game provides is instructive. It doesn't lead to some glorious new phase of human evolution. It leads to monstrosity, suffering, and ultimately self-destruction as the pathological patterns that enabled the rise to power become the same patterns that guarantee eventual failure. Because here's the final psychological insight about Wesker. His defeat was inevitable not because Chris was stronger or luckier, though both factors mattered, but because Wesker's psychology contained the seeds of its own destruction. The inability to trust anyone meant he always operated alone or with subordinates rather than genuine allies. The need to demonstrate superiority made him take unnecessary risks and create unnecessary confrontations. The inability to accurately assess risk led to increasingly reckless plans. The obsessive fixation on Chris created exploitable patterns. The complete psychological rigidity meant he couldn't adapt in ways that mattered when his standard approaches failed. A more psychologically flexible villain might have won. Someone capable of genuine alliances could have built a network too robust for individual heroes to dismantle. Someone without the need to demonstrate superiority could have worked in anonymity and been unstoppable. Someone capable of realistic risk assessment might have chosen plans that actually had a chance of succeeding. But Wesker couldn't be any of those things. His psychology was fixed. And that fixed psychology, for all its apparent strengths in terms of ruthlessness and lack of moral restraint, contained fatal weaknesses that ultimately destroyed him. So Albert Wesker stands as a psychological case study in what manufactured superiority, narcissistic pathology, and complete absence of empathy look like when taken to their extremes. He's a cautionary tale about what happens when intelligence is divorced from empathy, when capability is unmoored from moral restraint, when someone is shaped from childhood to see themselves as categorically superior to their own species. The result is something brilliant and terrifying and ultimately hollow, a God complex with nothing divine about it, just an empty void desperately trying to fill itself with power and domination, never understanding that no amount of power will ever be sufficient because the emptiness is the structure, not something that can be filled. He wanted to be a god. What he actually became was a cautionary tale about the dangers of manufacturing human beings to specification, about the psychological damage that extreme isolation and superiority conditioning can create, and about how even extraordinary intelligence and superhuman power can't compensate for fundamental psychological emptiness. In the end, for all his enhancements and abilities and carefully constructed philosophical justifications, Albert Wesker was just a broken person shaped by others into something monstrous, unable to ever become anything else, unable to even recognize that anything else might be worth becoming, and that, more than the body count or the grand evil plans, is what makes him psychologically tragic and terrifying in equal measure.